Hi everyone, so I'm going to do the fairy tale tag that I myself created a few days ago. And I'm going to have to split my answers into two videos because I'm too much of a nerd to trim down my thoughts on fairy tales. I just love it too much and I like to geek out. So yeah, there's going to be two videos and I hope that's okay and I hope you watch both of them. Righto, so let's get going. Question number one, what was your first introduction to fairy tales? Mine was a variety of things. I had, as a child, I was given tons and tons of storybooks, picture books of fairy tales, different anthologies and collections, and some were more very family friendly and like really watered down and very basic, simple versions of the tales, much shorter, and the accompanying illustrations would kind of follow on with that too. And then there were others where the illustrations were darker and more complex and things, and so the stories were kind of more true to their original format. They'd have the original endings even in some instances, and the tone was more adult and stuff, so it just depended. I honestly had so many like collected anthologies of fairy tales that yeah, it covered all the spectrum of like the age demographic and that kind of thing. So, and I've kept almost all of them to my knowledge. I've made sure not to throw any out, so I devoured them as a kid. I loved them. They were easily my favourite collections of tales, certainly, and yeah, I just would read them all the time, all the time. And what I loved was that some of the books, rather than just having the really basic canon of stories that everyone's really familiar with, there were a lot of obscure tales and stories from other cultures and things that were in there too. So it broadened my perspective of fairy tales, which was really cool. So there were storybooks. I was born right on the cusp of the second golden age, the renaissance of Disney films. So one of the first movies I ever saw at a cinema was The Little Mermaid. So I grew up on Disney fairy tales, and it was at that time that they were re-releasing, because there were VHS tapes out now, they were re-releasing all of their classic original fairy tales on tape, so home video, so you could watch them at home, rather than waiting to watch on the TV. So, you know, I grew up on like the stuff like Pinocchio and Snow White and Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty and all those as well, as in addition to the ones that were getting released, you know, Beauty and the Beast and Little Mermaid and those ones. So Disney certainly played a big part. Then there was TV, like a lot of TV shows that I grew up on had fairy tale elements to them, or they were incorporated into some of the storylines. There was like a TV show, a live action show that Rick Mayall hosted, or you know, was the narrator for, and it was like live action versions of fairy tales, and some of them were darker. Like I'm pretty sure they did Deerskin, that story. If anyone else remembers that show, please do give a shout out, because I can't remember what it was called, but I remember that one. He sat in a really crazy chair. I remember that. And yeah, there were animated cartoons and stuff that were like, and we had some animated cartoon videos that weren't Disney or anything that were fairy tales, so it's just a lot of it. It was everywhere. And yeah, and nursery rhymes and stuff, like songs on children's programs, you know, like educational children's programs were based around fairy tales. It was just everywhere. Really was everywhere. Question number two. Do you have a favourite fairy tale or a favourite fairy tale character? I don't know if I necessarily have a favourite fairy tale. There are lots that I find very interesting. Probably some of my favourite really well-known ones. I do very much like Beauty and the Beast. I both like and dislike the messages it carries, but I think ultimately if you're going to take it the right way, then I think it has a quite beautiful theme, beauty being on the inside and that kind of stuff. And it's heralded some of the most successful adaptations of that story, I think. Certainly Disney's Beauty and the Beast is my favoritist Disney film of the fairy tale canon, without a doubt, and there was a reason it was nominated for an Oscar. And I really came to like Little Red Riding Hood because of what I learnt about it from studying it, and the themes it carries that you may not realise it does, and how interesting its adaptations can be. So I've come to really like that one too. In terms of favourite fairy tale character, the one I'm probably the most intrigued by, because I just want to know more about her and her backstory and things, would probably be the Sea Witch in The Little Mermaid. And that is not to be confused with Ursula from the Disney film. Ursula is very awesome in her own way, but the Sea Witch in Anderson's story is an entirely different kettle of fish. Kettle of fish, ba-boom, ching. And she is quite morally grey and sort of a fence-sitter in terms of the debate between whether you know, the Little Mermaid should become a human or should stay a mermaid, and what the dealio is. She's quite an ambiguous kind of character. She's not good and she's not bad, and I just find her very interesting, and I want to know more about her. So I'd love if there was a story that focused on her. That would be really cool. Yeah, I just find her interesting. And for the most part, you tend to have a lot more fun with villains in general, and I think adaptations in films and that of fairy tales, you tend to just get more fun out of watching the villains, because they're more proactive. By their very nature, villains are more actively engaged in the story, for the most part. So they're just, yeah, it's just more interesting. Question number 3. Do you immediately associate fairy tales with their Disney incarnations? And if so, do you think this is a good thing or a bad thing? I do and I don't. Like I said, I really did grow up with Disney, and I can't escape it, and I am a huge Disney buff. I don't want you to think I'm dissing on Disney. I really love them. I can see their flaws though, and I can understand why there's been a lot of criticism with regards to Disney films and how it's made people perceive fairy tales. And because film and just Disney is such a strong influence culturally, and the impact it's had in terms of just entertainment for the masses, that it really has become a strong influence in how children especially view fairy tales and what they come to associate as being fairy tales. So you'll ask most little kids what Snow White looked like, what Cinderella looked like, that kind of thing. They will tell you the Disney princess version of it, and that's kind of unavoidable. I can understand that the criticism has come that has become the immediate association and not the original incarnations and versions of these stories. I don't know if there's a way around that really, but for myself, I'm really happy that I grew up with the Disney, but with my storybooks as well, so that I knew that there were other older versions of the tales and not just the ones I knew from the movies. So I've managed to split it in my head, and I think for the most part I've always been able to split it in my head, which I like. For instance, I had, growing up, very different feelings towards the Beauty and the Beast stories that I was reading, and Disney's Beauty and the Beast, the movie. Actually, as a kid, I was really terrified of the Beauty and the Beast film, but all the versions of the story I read I thought were really beautiful. So I knew how to split it and how to see it differently. I know Jack Snipes, has written really extensive commentary on Disney and fairy tales and what's gone on, and I can understand that people feel that they have tainted the tales in a way, because they have watered them down, they've dumbed them down, they've imported and shoved in their own cultural and social and sexual messages and themes and ideas and opinions, and especially the older versions of the Disney films, the ones from the 40s and the 30s and that, are especially ripe with this, and it's kind of not done the fairy tales any favours in a lot of ways, because it's amped up the sexism and the racism and all those sort of things. So you can see Disney as having had potentially a negative impact, but by the same token, it's ultimately introduced children to fairy tales in it's usually often the first way a kid learns about these fairy tales. So in that sense, it's a great stepping stone. And you know, aside from the fact that they're very entertaining movies for the most part, and there's great music and all the animation's gorgeous, and all that aside, the presentation of the fairy tales I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, but I can understand the criticism 100%. So I'm on both camps in this, really. I try my hardest not to immediately associate fairy tales with Disney, and I think that it's both a good and bad thing that we have a tendency to do that as a culture. But yeah, I can understand both sides of the argument, and I'm not trying to diss Disney, and I'm not trying to praise them too much either. But yeah, that's kind of just where I sit. Question number 4. Do you prefer lighter or darker renditions of the tales? Kind of like my Disney answer, sort of. I'm happy with both. I find the entertaining, light, fluffy ones to be really enjoyable, and if I'm in the right mood for that, that's great. And I think they can still, it doesn't mean that they necessarily lack substance or worth just because they're happier and they're not as dense and not as thematically heavy. They can still be a worthwhile read or watch or whatever. I have a tendency to like the darker ones a little more, I suppose, or I just find them more interesting because there is just more to work with their media. And I've come to really appreciate the scholastic side of viewing fairy tales from my my studies. And I find it fun and interesting, and it makes me question things more and ponder on stuff, and I just tend to be more engaged mentally and emotionally with the darker tales, simply because there's more to work with there. And I think also when you come to adapt it into other mediums, especially film, I think there are more ways you can, kind of like there are more ways you can criticize something than praise it. There are more ways that you can deal with the darker aspects of a tale, of fairy tales, than you can present them as just being what they are and, you know, having fun with it. I think there's just more room to work with, and more potential for things to do and explore and expand upon if you take a darker slant. I say I'm using darker a lot, but you know what I mean. More adult, more serious, I suppose. Of course, there are still an infinite number of ways you can screw it up, Snow White and Huntsman, but, yeah. Question number 5. Do you read fairy tale adaptations, retellings, and if so, who are some of your favourite authors? As you know, I love fairy tale retellings very much, Lee, and Juliet Marillier, certainly. Heart's Blood is easily my favouriteest of the fairy tale retellings I have read, and that's really saying something. People like Mercedes Lackey, who does darker fairy tale retellings, I think really cool, and she mixes them up and makes them her own very much, and the high fantasy stuff that's really cool. I'm just looking over. Jackson Pierce, I think, has a lot of fun with her fairy tales and has her own style there, which is cool. I really loved what Marissa Mayer did with Cinder. I thought that was really fun. But yeah, and of course, like someone who's a really standard, like Robin McKinley, she takes more traditional, straightforward approaches typically with her fairy tales, but they're still really beautifully written, so I have fun with those. So yeah, you know I'm a fairy tale lover, so I think I'll have to stop it here because I'm already going over what my time limit was going to be. I don't know how I'm going to fit the rest of the questions in the next video, but let's see how I go. I'll come back to you very soon.